Hello, friends, and welcome to episode number 1 of the You Have the Con podcast. My name is Paxton, and I'll be your host for this podcast and any other podcast that I am able to muster moving forward. Today, we will be looking through the lens of the UFO ET disclosure movement, and I'll be offering additional disclosures of ideas, facts, and considerations that are kept secret and hidden from us. Not in top secret files or highly guarded underground bunkers, but rather in plain sight, and if not right in plain sight, certainly accessible to us with minimal effort. But before we get to the actual subject matter of UFO ET disclosures, allow me to offer a brief introduction to the You Have the Con podcast. I am, no doubt, a lot like you. We are people, but we are also individuals, and so we are all unique from every other individual. There may be differences between us, such as hair, eyes, skin color, our height, male or female, our genetic makeup. There may be differences even in our capabilities, of course. But these are nothing more than the superficial aspects of our shared humanity. There is another trait we share, a private property we all possess, that is more important than all the superficial aspects of our shared humanity combined, and it is unique to each and every one of us. What am I talking about? It is what makes us human, the true origin of genuine diversity. I'm talking about your individual consciousness, your awareness of self, your very being, which gives you the intrinsic, inherent right to self-ownership. This is exactly why I'm calling this the You Have the Con podcast. As we individually make our way through the cosmos, it is important that we keep clearly in our sights the fact that each individual has the inherent right to define and redefine the cosmos as we individually see fit, based on our personal search, our personal study, and personal experience. History clearly shows that collectives of people can easily become, and more importantly, be led to become, irrational, fickle, and fearful, which is well known to lead to hate, hostility, and violent aggression, which is indicative of the absence, denial, or refusal of wisdom. This is intellectual bankruptcy. It has been well known for over 2,500 years that there is a cause and effect relationship between majority rule and tyranny. Majority rule is, after all, by very definition, anti-minority. In the light of history, we are able to observe that the representation of the individual is crucial in order to prevent such dehumanization and the oppression, violence, and slavery that invariably follow. This is why we should choose to say to one another, "You have the con." You have the con is a nautical navigation term that I find relevant and useful since we each have the responsibility of navigating through the cosmos. The con in You Have the Con refers to the conning tower of a ship, or a vantage point from which one can clearly see in all directions in order to accurately navigate one's vessel. In this particular context, that vessel is your unique consciousness. Why should we be willing to say "You have the con" to our fellow brothers and sisters here on Earth? Out of an honest and profound respect for the life, the liberty, and the pursuit of happiness of all people, and the free exchange of ideas emanating from the cosmos of consciousness within each and every individual on the planet. So we are going to begin this journey at the intersection of the following ideas. First is an idea that has been separately attributed to J.B.S. Haldane, Sir Arthur Eddington, and Werner Heisenberg, though I first heard it from one of my favorite philosophers and thinkers, Terence McKenna, the late Terence McKenna. I will humbly offer my own version, which is as follows. The cosmos is not only stranger and more magnificent than you suppose, it is stranger and more magnificent than you can suppose. Next, going back through time is an idea purported to have been expressed by Thomas Edison, which is, we do not know 1/1,000,000th of 1% about anything. Finally, going back to Socrates is the idea that the only true wisdom is knowing you know nothing. I believe most, if not all, of the horrific atrocities against humanity are the result of the deniers of these aphorisms, as well as these deniers' xenophobic drive to extinguish the historically new and very rare exaltation of the individual. To serve as sort of a condensation, suffice it to say that I am a singular soul, searching in the darkness, striving for a small semblance of lucidity to make some sense out of the swirling mixture of sensory stimuli, streaming subterfuge, superfluous sanctioned presumptions, and slippery slopes, simply seeking to ascertain a sufficient supply of those slivers of certainty within that cyclone. I am more than happy to be able to share this journey with any who wish to join in the search for truth, and in so doing, emancipate ourselves from mental slavery and realize that none but ourselves, individually, can free our minds, as Marcus Garvey said and Bob Marley helped immortalize. And now on to the task at hand. UFO ET disclosures. Remember, this is the lens, the context we'll be using to look at other issues, so we will not be fixated on the UFO ET phenomenon. Stick with me here because there is a much bigger picture toward which we are looking. This is also the introductory episode of the You Have the Con podcast, and this will be a good way to get an overview of the waters through which we will be navigating.
Want to take a ride?
To be honest, I never expected or really considered that my first podcast would be in any way related to UFOs or the topic of UFOs. I am not a UFO researcher, nor would I even consider myself an enthusiast. I'm more of a tourist, though I did look into the phenomenon more so than I ever have in the past while working on this podcast. I do not, however, have any current plans for other UFO-related podcasts unless this one warrants more than one episode. But not that I would rule it out. Maybe I'll choose to revisit the topic once I'm not just shooting from the hip with the podcast thing. I do, in fact, find it a little odd that this is how I'm starting. However, I have personally seen some very strange and very curious things in the sky, which we will get to. And the topic of UFOs, I find, is a very useful lens through which to view the world and our shared experience on it, as I mentioned. What I mean by that is this: there are many topics that fall within the shade, if you will, of the UFO phenomenon, because it touches a nerve that I believe we all share, regardless of what you believe about the actual incidents and experiences. It touches upon our concepts of humanity and our place in the cosmos, which can be very sensitive issues. So the mere idea of the UFO ET phenomenon holds a lot of potential power. The concept of humanity, in turn, can lead to important considerations of consciousness, religion, spirituality, politics, education, etc., which are all major considerations in and of themselves. And then, of course, there's the whole spectrum of technology, which leads to many other important considerations like zero-point energy, which is, what they call free energy, possibly the entire gamut of genetics, manipulation, splicing, enhancement, engineering, modification, artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, transhumanism. It's a lot of different potential topics. So in actuality, then, this podcast will be using the UFO ET phenomenon as a context in which to view and consider the world. It's like if you have seen the M. Night Shyamalan movie Signs. It has aliens, it has UFOs, and they're a big part of the story, but the story is not actually about UFOs and extraterrestrials. That's simply the lens, and the movie is about losing faith and regaining it in the context of an alien invasion. That's what I mean by using the UFO ET phenomenon as a lens through which we will look at the world. Does that make sense? If not, I'm sure it will become more clear as we move forward. So to begin with, have you ever had a UFO experience? Or how about any experience that defies or challenges what we are told by the so-called experts has to be the truth? Or an experience that makes you want to ask questions that make your friends and family screw up their faces and look at you a little bit funny. If you have had such an experience, you may have found, as I have, that it definitely makes you less likely to dismiss accounts of similar experiences out of hand or as a knee-jerk reaction. If you have given any attention at all to this issue, you are probably aware that the subject of unidentified flying objects, unexplained aerial phenomena, or anomalous aerial vehicles, or whichever designation you prefer, and we really can't forget whomever it is that owns and operates these craft. But this whole UFO ET subject has moved a substantial distance away from the periphery, or the fringe, because back in the day, this used to be a totally far out there concept, right? But now, the ideas and the issues surrounding these incidents and experiences are not so easily marginalized or cast aside as in the past. In fact, this phenomenon has actually gained a fair amount of credibility and traction, not just in UFO subculture circles as it was decades ago, but it has a pretty good foothold in the mainstream media. So to begin with, I want to give a little bit of background of the UFO phenomenon. This is an extremely abbreviated and thoroughly incomplete history, but it is some of the major points, so we kind of have a good starting place. So to begin, there are many people who are convinced that something otherworldly crashed near Roswell, New Mexico on July 8th, 1947. But shortly before that, on June 24th, 1947, pilot Kenneth Arnold stated that he witnessed several craft, I believe it was 9 vehicles, flying in formation at around, the reports are between like 1,200 and 1,800 miles per hour, while he was flying also in the area of Mount Rainier in Washington. This may actually be where the term flying saucer originated, but not only due to the shape of the craft, but also because Arnold claimed that the vehicle's movements were like a saucer that had been skipped across the water. Then there are those who believe that Germany had several types of electromagnetic field propulsion type vehicles around World War II, which leads to possible questions about Project Paperclip, which is its own rabbit hole that we may discuss in time.
You have to get anyone that can be useful to us out of Berlin before they do.
During World War II, many pilots claimed to have seen strange craft in the air with them that they called Foo Fighters at the time. And in fact, Kenneth Arnold claimed that he spoke to World War II pilots who said that they had actually been briefed that they may encounter strange craft in the air with them. In 1952, there was a significant sighting in the D.C. area, including something that sounded very similar to what I've seen during an experience that I will detail a bit later. And in fact, even some of the earliest World War II accounts described similar craft. Of course, then there are the abduction accounts. You have the Barney and Betty Hill abduction case, Whitley Strieber, Travis Walton, to reference some of the better-known accounts, but there are many others. Some benign, while others are horrifying and, shall we say, rather invasive. There are also the cattle mutilation, the crop circle cases, which are strange. I recently watched a documentary about some 1966 Westall High School incident in Melbourne, Australia, that I had never heard about. One of the witnesses to that incident made comments about the area where a craft had landed that had interesting similarities to the crop circles we hear about today. So I thought that was interesting. Then we come up to the present information age, where there are accounts from all over the world on a very regular basis, including reports from military and commercial pilots, law enforcement, astronauts. Recently, I even saw interviews on both CNN and Fox with an ex-government employee, if I remember correctly, he was from the Pentagon, stating that his experiences made him believe that something is definitely happening. So it becomes harder and harder to simply say there's nothing going on. You can't just post some kind of a cop in front of the evidence or all these, evidence of all these experiences and say, there's nothing to see here, move along, people. Obviously, something is going on. What that something is, well, that is, of course, the crux of the matter. Someone is controlling these craft that are being seen, right? Who are they and what are their intentions? So that's what has led me to this seemingly strange decision to lead off with a podcast related to UFOs. It's been going on for many decades and possibly centuries, who knows. And it's becoming an increasingly common occurrence in our world today. So there must be a reason for it. It's going to come into play at some point and possibly be thrust to the forefront of your consciousness in some manner and in some context and for some purpose. It's far too prevalent and too far-reaching in its implications to simply be meaningless noise. So I believe it's a good idea to at least look at the issue openly and in the context of historical facts to see if any answers or patterns emerge that may add to our understanding of the phenomenon. Many of you likely know of or have heard of Tom DeLonge and his recent push for UFO disclosure. I believe it was last year he showed up on Joe Rogan's podcast discussing his efforts to remove the veils of secrecy surrounding the UFO phenomenon. He's certainly not the first, but he is one of the more outspoken people in the UFO community of late. People like Dr. Stephen Greer have been working towards similar ends since, I believe, the early 90s, and I will be discussing his efforts after a while. But if you don't know, DeLonge was a guitar player from Blink-182, which was, I think, a 1990s commercially palatable punk band. And I want to discuss his platform a bit since it's rather new, and it's also being presented in a rather organized fashion with some decent marketing behind it. So it's one of the more recent efforts to push this out into the, closer to the forefront of our consciousness. First, this is kind of an aside, but coming up in the 80s, punk to me was Minor Threat, Sex Pistols, Suicidal Tendencies, bands like that. So I have a little trouble referring to Blink-182 as punk. It's like plastic punk, or one could say bubblegum punk, possibly Barbie and Ken punk, which I believe is a rather sad commentary on the trajectory on which society finds itself. Don't you think? Commercially palatable punk. Seriously, think about that. But whatever though, the same thing happened with alternative music, if you recall. In the late 80s and the early 90s, there were a lot of very, very cool local grunge bands, even in the Midwest. And then suddenly there was an alternative section at Kmart right next to all the other commercially viable sections. That may seem like a digression, but I promise you it is not. This will actually become relevant shortly as we continue this discussion. Just wait and see. Anyway, DeLonge and his To the Stars Academy, as they call it, have begun releasing some disclosures, which is the hot button word these days, right? Alien and UFO disclosure. It's something that's been coming up more and more frequently, as you are very likely aware. Mr. DeLonge and a group of people affiliated with the military and intelligence sectors, CIA, DOD types, have been releasing disclosures here and there, and it is evidently their plan to continue to do so toward a particular end that we will soon discuss. First and foremost, however, let me ask this question. Is substantial involvement by military intelligence personnel supposed to instill a high degree of confidence in the move toward disclosure? Military intelligence is quite well known for their tactics specifically geared towards what they call the winning of hearts and minds. I'm sure you've heard this phrase before, right? The winning of hearts and minds. This is otherwise known as what? How about psychological operations? That's right. And it should make you want to turn your critical thinking meter up to at least 11. I'm just saying. It's not an area in which we should be complacently ignorant here, I believe. So, who is a part of this To the Stars Academy? We have people from various alphabet agencies, so exactly what kind of alphabet soup are we talking about here? Well, I believe we have a CIADO, an ASTDIO, and a DODSIO, to name a few. So, to explain that, one of the individuals is a 25-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency's Directorate of Operations. That's the CIADO. This was formerly known, and I would say more honestly known, as the clandestine service. They no doubt decided that clandestine service doesn't sit as well with the people or gives too much of a negative impression. They pretty much did the same thing with the Department of Defense, because it used to be more honestly called the War Department, right? They're very sneaky that way with words. But essentially, CIA DO is covert ops or black ops, so, obviously worthy of your utmost trust and confidence. Then we have, I believe, the ASTDIO, a former deputy assistant to the Secretary of Defense for Intelligence Oversight, I believe. Then there is the DOD-SIO, it's a Department of Defense Senior Intelligence Officer, who evidently had some sensitive responsibilities, including a Pentagon Aerospace Threat Identification Program focusing on unidentified aerial technologies. Also in the mix is a Lockheed Martin Program Director for Advanced Systems at Skunk Works, which is largely classified, very high-level research and development. So, yeah, just, your average, everyday, run-of-the-mill kind of people, right? Reminds me of that song from Sesame Street when I was a kid. You remember that song? It went like, Lockheed Martin Program Director for Advanced Systems is a person in your neighborhood, in your neighborhood, in your neighborhood. You remember that song? These are the kind of people you would go next door and borrow sugar from when you were growing up, remember? Obviously. But those would seem to be some very heavy hitters, right? In the intelligence community. Now, I want you to listen to what the To the Stars Academy mission statement says about these individuals. This was quoted in the December 20th, 2017 issue of Guitar World. Their presentation of the mission statement may have changed, but I'm sure it gives the same overall idea. We are more concerned with considering the language that is used. So, this is the quote. It says that these individuals all share a common thread of frustration and determination to disrupt the status quo, wanting to use their expertise and credibility to bring transformative science and engineering out of the shadows and collaborate with global citizens to apply that knowledge in a way that benefits humanity. Doesn't that make you feel all warm and fuzzy? Now, that's a big statement with some very lofty goals. So we had best define some terms since there is such a high level of military intelligence involvement. Military intelligence means psychological operations, and psychological operations typically include manipulating the language of the target populations in order to win hearts and minds. That being the case, it's critical that we make sure that our hearts and our minds remain our own. Their mission statement, like many similar mission statements, seems to denote a sense of brotherhood, togetherness, freedom, and justice, which of course sounds amazing, right? Of course it does. Who doesn't want that stuff? But throughout history, there's often been this very similar, extremely enticing call for pretty much the same thing, using the phrase liberty, equality, and fraternity. This phrase has regularly been twisted and subtly redefined and then used to control and subjugate the people, usually under a banner of some sort which requires our servitude. Of course, often the servitude is called cooperation. It's important to keep this in mind, and I would ask that you please do so as we consider the language of their mission statement, beginning with the use of the phrase status quo. These high-level military intelligence folk are frustrated about the status quo. What is the status quo? What is the existing state of affairs? This is what status quo means. Well, the status quo right now and throughout all of our history actually is that the state, or we could also use the term the man, under varying political systems, manifestations, and paradigms, and of course those entrenched in those systems, including people like our military and intelligence buddies. But this apparatus, the state, the man, feeds parasitically off the people and therefore typically does everything it can to turn the people from powerful and unique individuals into cogs of its machines and pawns in its games, or it simply discards those who get in the way. Is that what they're planning to change? For example, are they going to be working towards giving the knowledge of these transformative technologies directly to the people so as to increase our independence from the state? Or will they just use them to continue to learn us our place, to treat us like children, to use us, the people, as resources? and then just brush scraps down to us from the tables that we ultimately pay for? Does To the Stars Academy's particular call for liberty, equality, and fraternity mean something different than this ever-present status quo? Let's define this a little further, since the word fraternity may not be as familiar or as commonly utilized as in the past. Fraternity is simply another way to say brotherhood. And I thought it was interesting to note as well that it can also refer to a sort of religious kind of a brotherhood. However, it would be more useful for us, instead of using the word fraternity, to use the more trendy pop culture and strategically viable term for the winning of hearts and minds and call it inclusive community, since this is how the term fraternity is currently being framed. We need to be absolutely certain that this change in the status quo of which they speak means something more than the people being permitted the freedom to be equally controlled and subjugated by this inclusive community. Because that would only amount to a change in the packaging and definitions of the same controls while essentially maintaining the same old status quo, the same ages-old royal fables and noble lies. This cannot be stressed strongly enough. The status quo is that we the people cannot be trusted with truth and power. The mission statement goes on to say that they want to collaborate with global citizens. We'll come back to the word collaborate in a little more depth, since it, as well as the word cooperate, which we've already touched upon, are also regularly used these days in a sort of a skewed and twisted context. But they say they want to collaborate with global citizens. Now, maybe by global citizen, they just mean an inhabitant of Earth, which would be fine. However, one definition of citizen is as follows: a naturalized member of a state who owes allegiance to its government and is entitled to its protection. Now, if this is their intended usage, to whom are we presumed to owe allegiance specifically? Does this protection include protection of our natural human rights? How will the people be represented in the protection of those rights in order for us to maintain self-ownership and avoid the long-standing status quo, the ownership of the people by the state or the man? These are important questions that we too often fail to interject on our own behalf because we merely assume, and I should add dangerously assume, that our definitions coincide to any relevant degree with those of people who occupy immensely powerful positions within the social construct or establishment. You see, these are often people who couldn't possibly represent you even if they were to honestly care to try for once. And that brings us to the use of the word humanity. First, I want to pose this question. Do you really think we should trust, or that it would be wise for us to trust, that our concept of humanity coincides with that of people whose careers necessarily require and depend upon lying, and often much, much worse than lying, in the pursuit of covert agendas? Just something you might want to ponder before pandering to people just because they put a string of letters behind their name to make you believe they have credibility. In the context of their mission statement, the definition of the word humanity will largely depend on the other definitions we have discussed. The word humanity is often used because it sounds very inclusive. And the word inclusive is also another one of those major buzzwords like collaboration, cooperation, community. You hear them all the time. However, if the change in status quo is only a change in the type of scraps and or the amount of scraps we are allowed by the man, by the central scrutinizers, and our human rights are merely what a consensus of experts or the proclamation of high priests say they are, and we have no choice but to collaborate or cooperate with the consensus, otherwise face exclusion from the inclusive community, then humanity means what it most often has down through time. It means property. It means resource. It means slave. It is of absolutely no consequence if it is also called inclusive. That's nothing more than tactical semantics, which, in all honesty, could simply mean that we will all be shackled together, metaphorically, physically, or both. On a related note, I would suggest that you go check out one of the logos that To the Stars Academy uses. The one to which I refer has 3 circles in a triangular pattern with lettering in the center and beams emanating outward. While it does coincide with their mission statement, one could also say that it bears a striking resemblance to the pyramid capstone with the eye in the middle. Not to mention the intersection of science, engineering, and media does have a kind of a square and compass sort of feel to it for what it's worth. But I just wanted to include that. Some people find that kind of stuff interesting. It is kind of interesting because you do see these symbols popping up all over the place. So, like I said, for what it's worth, if you're interested in that sort of thing. Okay, moving on. Politicians, for decades now, have also expressed their interest in the topic or claim to have a desire to shed light on the mysteries of UFOs. Both of the Clintons have spoken of wanting to uncover what they call the truth, and their buddy, John Podesta, has also mentioned it. In fact, DeLong actually had some email exchanges with Podesta that were discovered in the DNC email link. So that's kind of interesting, although I do have to say that to me, looking to politicians is not really indicative of actually looking for the truth. I personally fail to find any real reason to believe politicians have much interest in the truth or to expect that it will be forthcoming from them. That's just me. But in any case, it's definitely not very punk rock, I don't think. Hopefully, DeLong realizes that God Save the Queen and her fascist regime was not the Sex Pistols' call to action. Just throwing that out there. Many of you may remember this quote from Ronald Reagan decades ago. This is in 1987 in an address to the UN General Assembly, although I do believe he used this same phrase or similar phrase in a few other speeches. But the quote at that particular speech is as follows. Perhaps we need some outside universal threat to make us recognize this common bond. I occasionally think how quickly our differences worldwide would vanish if we were facing an alien threat from outside this world. All right. And then much more recently, I believe this is 2014, Bill Clinton said something very similar to one of those late-night talking heads who are there to reinforce what you're supposed to believe. Clinton said, speaking of the UFO phenomenon, may be the only way to unite this increasingly divided world of ours. If they're out there, think of how all the differences among people on Earth would seem small if we felt threatened by a space invader. Space invader. Anyway, first of all, in response to those quotes, I think it's critically important to point out that these differences and divisions of which these former presidents speak are usually cultivated and perpetuated and exploited by these very same political types because differences and division are the only things that make the politician's existence necessary. That's called divide and conquer. It's also called vested interest. It's also called history. Anyway, notice where they immediately take the idea of an extraterrestrial presence. This is, unfortunately, not uncommon at all. In fact, it's far, far too common. It's the very old common enemy, common good scheme or ploy that has remained the favored tactic of the kings of the earth and their puppet political leaders throughout history. A favored strategy of those who presume to have cornered the market on your best interests. You see, they know what your best interests are. You don't really even have to think about it. Actually, it works way better for them if you don't think about it. And in fact, they are absolutely counting on it. Now, in a bit, I will get to my personal UFO experiences, I promise. But first, I'm going to spend a little time on this concept of the common good and how it is used to create and mold public opinion to maintain the status quo. The common good is the very tool used to steal the human assets that are liberty, equality, and fraternity, our inherent freedom, our equality of individual worth, and our innate brotherhood. Not simply to steal them, however, but these most crucial private properties of humans are turned into weapons against the people. It's really not unlike ripping your arm off of your body and beating you with it about the face and head while telling you it's for your own good. The common good is the focal point around which humanity is routinely collectivized. As has been said by thinkers like Ayn Rand, who lived through just such a scenario, she noted, totalitarianism is collectivism. Collectivism means the subjugation of the individual to a group, whether to a race, class, or state, does not matter. Collectivism holds that man must be chained to collective action and collective thought for the sake of what is called the common good. Throughout history, no tyrant ever rose to power except on the claim of representing the common good. Napoleon served the common good of France. Hitler was serving the common good of Germany. Horrors, which no man would dare consider for his own selfish sake, are perpetrated with a clear conscience by altruists who justify themselves by the common good. So, the common good has long been a very effective tool for homogenizing the plasticized herd and to get it moving in the pre-decided direction. This call to the common good has indeed served people like Napoleon and Hitler, but also Lenin, Mao, kings, popes, presidents, generals, bankers, and these so-called philanthropists. The common good allows for the most horrific acts of violence and oppression to be perpetrated by its obsequious slaves and pandering sycophants who actually believe themselves to be fighting violence and oppression and acting out of altruism just because the pronouncements of high priests or the consensus of experts told them it was for the common good. It's actually amazing because it almost never doesn't work. In 1928, the very first paragraphs in a book written by Sigmund Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays, a book called Propaganda, reads as follows. The conscious and intelligent manipulation of the organized habits and opinions of the masses is an important element in democratic society. Those who manipulate this unseen mechanism of society constitute an invisible government which is the true ruling power of our country. We are governed, our minds are molded, our tastes formed, our ideas suggested, largely by men we have never heard of. This is a logical result of the way in which our democratic society is organized. Vast numbers of human beings must cooperate in this manner if they are to live together as a smoothly functioning society. Again, that's 1928. Of course, no one likes to think they're simply an ingredient of homogenization or a variable in an algorithmic equation. But people do seem to accept it rather easily if instead it's called diversity and the word equality is thrown about all out of context. Sadly, far too many people seem to be none the wiser in the face of these fallacious tactical uses of language. But it is of the utmost importance that we guard against such deceptions. Bernays says we must cooperate, and we could also use the word collaborate, as we mentioned earlier. But isn't that a contradiction in terms to say that someone must cooperate or must collaborate? Isn't that the same as volunteer or face negative reinforcement, since we're basically talking about operant conditioning? That's not cooperation. And that's why he basically says you must be manipulated into cooperation. See, to cooperate means to work jointly toward the same end. To say someone must cooperate presumes to impose an outcome or agenda upon that person, or, as in this case, massive groups of people. What he actually means is you must bend to our will. In fact, these tactics and strategies have been so successful that a great many under their spell appear to think it was their own idea to bend to the will of the man to begin with. These become the people who in turn are used to manipulate those who have the audacity to think independently. This calls to mind Bertrand Russell's statement in his 1953 book, The Impact of Science on Society, about how to scientifically manage the herd. Shortly after, Russell essentially discusses the potential of training students to accept the consensus of experts rather than objective facts, and also the cost per student to achieve this impact. He goes on to say, the populace will not be allowed to know how its convictions were generated. When the technique has been perfected, every government that has been in charge of education for a generation will be able to control its subjects securely without the need of armies or policemen. Let me repeat that very first sentence. The populace will not be allowed to know how its convictions were generated. And just how successful has this so-called scientific impact been? Well, remember moments ago I alluded to how punk and grunge music were essentially co-opted. This is the genius and precision of the sort of operant conditioning of which we are speaking. Any movements or trends that begin to look like they could threaten the man can easily be subverted and then absorbed by the same system, the same establishment that they were supposed to oppose, and instead of standing in defiance of the man, they end up as part of the system and cooperating or collaborating with the man. Historically, I believe this was actually J.P. Morgan's contribution to the Rhodes Roundtable groups, which we'll get into at some point. But it's a matter of using their immense financial resources to infiltrate and subvert movements that could threaten them, essentially. But in time, this results in a situation where we have regular or continual protests, marches, and riots carried out by those believing themselves to be revolutionaries who are working in pursuit of more and more control by the man rather than standing for independence from the man. In my relatively short time on the earth, I've seen the man, the central scrutinizers, the establishment, the state, or whatever you want to call it. I think conspiracy theorists like George Bush and Bill Clinton and George Soros and Heinz Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, and many others, they actually call it the New World Order.
What we are looking at is good and evil, right and wrong. A new world order. A new world order. A new world order. We're not about to make that same mistake. A new world order.
But I've seen this system create a very intriguing situation wherein they have a ready supply of what I have previously called obsequious slaves and pandering sycophants who have been so bamboozled that they believe that they are engaged in a grassroots anti-establishment movement that happens to be tirelessly working in pursuit of greater and increasing limits upon the ability and capacity of the people to express their innate humanity. It is like completely backwards. And that's no small thing. In fact, in many instances, it's almost the only thing, this molding of public opinion. And I believe it's extremely important to keep this concept, this tactic, this strategy in mind when considering the topic of UFOs. Any topic of political significance, actually, but the matter of UFO disclosure, I mean, seriously? Think of the profound implications of such an event and the potential ramifications of actual government disclosure to the effect that UFOs have been identified and ETs are among us. You really need to honestly and seriously consider the amount of power that exists in the control of such information, but more importantly, in the control of the way it is presented to the public. This is extremely heavy stuff to lay on people. And this is critical to remember, my friends. It's extremely heavy stuff to lay on people, even if it's only partially true or only true in a certain context. Knowing what everyone should know about politicians and how, by their actions, they clearly prostrate themselves before those in the true thrones of power, which would be their corporate and gang-banking masters. Wouldn't it figure, when it comes to the dissemination of such information, that the level of, the honesty of, and the manner of dissemination of such profound knowledge or information, whether it's true or not, could and likely would be used toward a particular end, in support of a specific agenda, to guide public opinion in a predetermined direction toward a preconceived consensus? I mean, if social management or some sort of scientific societal construct is part of your plan, it would be a great shame to waste such an immense opportunity to further plunder the resources and independence of the people, which is, again, the ever-present status quo. We have to keep this in mind because, you can't make an omelet without breaking a few eggs. And many of us may need to be sacrificed or yield more and more of our humanity to support the greater good. Therefore, we eggs better think about what this really means. You see, they love to talk about humanity and how much they care for humanity. In this context, this false, synthetic, inorganic inclusivity within the latest iteration of the common good, your humanity is exactly what? Well, for one thing, certainly defined by someone who is not you. Chances are it's going to be the bureaucratic experts looking at a formula and checking off boxes. And if you are found to be out of sync with what some faceless consensus has decided regarding your humanity, you may find yourself excluded from the inclusivity. Of course, the glaring contradiction and hypocrisy not even making the slightest blip on many people's radar. I mean, you want to belong, right? It's trendy and it's popular and all the cool kids are doing it. So you see what I'm getting at? It's this same old tactic of very powerful, influential, and extremely deceitful people using the facade of governmental authority and the label of experts to define the common good for their benefit, not yours, not ours, and forcing us to cooperate. It could be the perfect plan for the totalitarian, monopolistic opportunists that like to promote and work towards what is being called seamless control of the people, starting basically inside your house, extending outward to the feeble construct you're supposed to call community, to the city, state, national, regional, and finally to the global management of us human resources. But of course, don't take my word for it. The UN's Commission on Global Governance said it like this: regionalism must precede globalism. We foresee a seamless system of governance from local communities, individual states, regional unions, and up through to the United Nations itself. So there you go. Now let's just simplify the concept of the common good, because it's always the same message that echoes down through time. The medium and the strategy of administration may change, but the message is identical. So here it is. You need to be saved. You need to be saved, and we, your betters, are the ones who are going to save you. Even if you don't realize it, your soul is in mortal danger, and if you don't do what we say as we say, your soul is doomed. We have our very best people working on this, and they have determined what your best interests are. You must conform to them because it's in your best interest, or things may not go well for you. And let this serve as a warning. Heresy will not be tolerated, as it will detract from our capacity to save others. No, I'm afraid you cannot refuse to be saved by us, because that would not be in your best interest. As we said, our best people have decided this for you, and they are clearly the best, not only because we, your betters, say so, but note the experts' pieces of paper to that effect, and their titles of importance, and their definitive attire. Also, after much funding from us, they all agree that they are correct, so no further discussion is necessary or permitted. If you refuse to be saved, you will be considered evil, and then you will be a danger to those of us who agreed to be saved by us. You will be saved by us, as we say, or you will be defined as a savage, and our disciples may treat you savagely. Your betters have spoken. That's it. It's basically never not that. Then, of course, you just rinse the blood from the streets and repeat. I think it's also important to point out that every time the common good is used to steal the humanity away from us humans, many people are convinced that in this particular instance, which is always the present, the now, it really is the common good. So the question becomes, is it happening right now? Is there a current focal point being imposed upon us all right now from which we had best not avert our dutiful gaze and involuntary worship? Well, I know people hate to hear this, but what about climate change? Oh, did you hear that? I think that was the sound of a multitude of undergarments getting all bunched up simultaneously. Wait, let me guess. This time, it really is the common good, and so defamation, theft, imprisonment, violence, and general dehumanization are all justified. Yep, always is. It never isn't. It's almost like magic that way, isn't it? And of course, I'm not in any way saying I don't care about the environment. So let's not get into that false dichotomy. In fact, I know I care about it more than anyone, like, say, Leonardo DiCaprio, who, despite his evangelizing to promote the critical fear and doom of climate change, has no problem taking a private jet to France to collect an environmental award. You can't even make this stuff up. I mean, it's amazing. So maybe being a mouthpiece for people who want to put the finger of blame right on us regular people without private jets is how, or at least part of how, he pays for his extravagant indulgences. I mean, he must have been adequately absolved of these sins, because this is serious business, and no one would lie about such a thing as global warming, climate change, right? Well, this is a quote from Timothy Worth, who used to be a president of the UN Foundation. He said, "We've got to ride this global warming issue. Even if the theory of global warming is wrong, we will be doing the right thing in terms of economic and environmental policy." Okay. And then how about Stephen Schneider? This is a Stanford professor of climatology. He was one of the lead authors of many of the IPCC reports. He said this: "We need to get some broad-based support to capture the public's imagination. So we have to offer up scary scenarios, make simplified, dramatic statements, and make little mention of any doubts. Each of us has to decide what the right balance is between being effective and being honest." To capture the public's imagination. What would you call that? Would you call that the winning of hearts and minds, maybe? Molding of public opinion? That's what I'd call it. I'd also call it lying to people in the name of science. Al Gore said something similar. He said this: "I believe it is appropriate to have an overrepresentation of factual presentations on how dangerous it is as a predicate for opening up the audience to listen to what the solutions are and how hopeful it is that we are going to solve this crisis." An overrepresentation of factual presentations. That's called a lie, plain and simple. Al Gore and his ilk believe it is appropriate to lie to the people. You need to be lied to in order to get your head right. So I guess, is that how this inclusive community works? I see. We need to be manipulated into cooperation with what the solutions are. Mind you, not what solutions the people would like to consider or explore. They're not interested in input from the lowly people. Their plan is a lie to you, so you will accept the preordained solutions about which we have no say. So again, I guess we are excluded from that part of the inclusive community. Wow, what a big surprise. That's so much different than the status quo. Moving on to another quote. This is from Monica Kopacz, I think is how you pronounce that. She was an atmospheric scientist. But she says, "It is no secret that a lot of climate change research is subject to opinion. That climate models sometimes disagree even on the signs of future changes. For example, drier versus wetter climate. The problem is only sensational exaggeration makes the kind of story that will get politicians and readers' attention. So yes, climate scientists might exaggerate, but in today's world, this is the only way to assure any political action and thus more federal financing to reduce the scientific uncertainty." The problem is, says the scientist, you need to be lied to. You see, since the research is subject to opinion, your opinions need to be properly managed and mitigated. This is the same scientific impact we previously mentioned. You need to be manipulated in today's world, Monica says. To which I would ask, what does today have to do with anything? The people have always been lied to in this manner. This is the status quo. And why do you need to be manipulated into cooperation? I mean, other than this being an important element in democratic society, as pointed out by Edward Bernays, because they don't want to lose funding. They want more and more of your money. That's what federal financing is, your money. Well, that's a relief, right? As long as we can be certain that they have no vested interest in money like those horrible oil companies. And they need your money for what? To reduce scientific uncertainty. Well, that sounds nice. Let's talk about that scientifically. This is a quote from the UN's IPCC. Okay? And before you begin to call them the insane posse of climate clowns, or the intolerant panel of coercive cooperation, or the infallible pretentious climate cronies, understand that sometimes they do put out good, solid science. And they did just that in their third assessment report in 2001. On page 774, they came up with this inconvenient truth. In climate research and modeling, we should recognize that we are dealing with a coupled, nonlinear, chaotic system, and therefore that long-term prediction of future climate states is not possible. So we're going to have to look at some more definitions because, as you know, or as we all know, by is not possible, they must surely mean highly likely or most likely, possibly even absolute certainty, since all the smartest people certainly know we are facing Armageddon-esque catastrophic doom that is right around the corner and coming right for us. So let's start with nonlinear. This is essentially a mathematical term, so I looked into what mathematicians say about nonlinear systems. They say this, that in a general sense, you can only solve nonlinear equations if the systems are fairly small and simple. All right, well, there you go. So are we talking about a small and simple system? The Earth's climate, with its initial conditions being billions of years ago, covering a spherical surface with a circumference of about 25,000 miles, must be a small and simple system, I guess. So it's good to get that scientific perspective. The mathematicians go on to say that there are decent algorithms that you can apply that will solve any linear system of equations. Doesn't matter how many variables you have, from whether you got 2, whether you got 10,000. It may take longer if you have more variables, but the algorithm works. The instant you include a nonlinear equation, all bets are off. You are on your own. There are some things that can be done that will work in certain cases, but there's no general method of solving nonlinear systems. And in fact, most are actually unsolvable. So we have not only a nonlinear system, which is not predictable, you cannot predict it, you can't solve it. It is also a coupled nonlinear system. So that would increase, well, you'd think that would increase the complexity, right? And in describing the climate further, this coupled nonlinear system is also called a chaotic system, right? So is a chaotic system, does that sound like a simple, small, simple system? Well, let's find out what a chaotic system is. A chaotic system is a complex system. Sounds different than simple to me. It's a complex system that shows sensitivity to initial conditions. In such systems, any uncertainty, no matter how small, in the beginning will produce rapidly escalating and compounding errors in the prediction of the system's future behavior. To make an accurate prediction of long-term behavior of such systems, the initial conditions must be known in their entirety and to an infinite level of accuracy. In other words, it is impossible to predict the future behavior of any complex, chaotic system. And remember, this is a coupled, nonlinear, chaotic system. So it would seem that it's not quite as simple, and not quite as certain as we are made to believe that it is, in order to claim ownership of our resources. Based on this, their scientific certainty is actually infinitesimal. And there's no way, scientifically speaking, for it to be otherwise, no matter how much money they get. Scientifically speaking, I would say it's a racket, just like the military-industrial complex, and a black hole of funding. Again, I am not saying that protecting and respecting the environment isn't important. I truly believe that it is. I always have, even long before all the indoctrination began. But turning control of our resources over to the powers and constructs that tell you point blank that you need to be manipulated and controlled, that you don't deserve the truth, seems counterproductive. Turning such control over to these powers that have never done anything but poison and pollute the entire earth and its people, both physically and philosophically, seems totally counterintuitive. This is especially true when we take into account that the people at the top of those constructs of power have caused more damage to this earth and its people than you and everyone you've ever known ever could in many, many lifetimes. Yet, that is the proposal for the common good, because we, the common people, are the real problem. Go figure. That's the status quo. But of course, we don't really have to worry about such things because our politicians are there to protect us, right? They are all of the most noble and moral character, correct? Fine, not all, but definitely the ones on your chosen side, right? Your party, your faction, your gang, whichever set you rep. They are the cream that has risen to the top, our best and our brightest, yes? A great many of whom, for as long as I've been on this planet, most certainly have the blood of innocent people on their hands. Go ahead and reconcile those two ideas, if you can. They wage frivolous wars of aggression and coercion under the guise of spreading democracy, and even those who are supposed to be the opposition on the other side of the aisle raise their fists and vote with conviction, as one recent presidential hopeful did, for the same wars that kill hundreds of thousands of the innocent women and children they incessantly proclaim to care about. One even got a Nobel Peace Prize before going on to spend his entire administration at war. They talk about rights, they talk about humanity, all the while infringing continually upon the people's capacity to express their humanity and rights fully and independently of them. Many of us have sadly been reduced to voting for our favorite liars and the lies we prefer to hear. We shouldn't need to be told that politicians lie as a matter of course. It's like a skill set and a prerequisite to the position. You already know this. So ask yourself seriously and honestly, do you think UFO disclosure will be any different? Do you think the issue of UFO disclosure is somehow immune to this status quo? I personally have a very difficult time believing that it would be, and this particular disclosure will be made more clear as we proceed. So, given that there do appear to be vehicles that seem very anomalous to most of us in our skies from time to time, let's just say, what if? What if some sort of UFO disclosure actually happened? That is to say, what if there were some very definitive, undeniable mass sightings that forced the issue to the front of our consciousness? A global media event with experts telling us what they have decided the truth should be and what the solutions to the situation are. How will we know they're telling us the truth? We've already discussed and seen examples of how we are to be manipulated into cooperation. Wouldn't discretionary wisdom dictate that we at least ask the questions? How could such a disclosure be used to further mold public opinion in a certain direction? What might be the clues that could indicate that such a disclosure is simply another ends justify the means kind of ploy to get you to go all in and cooperate with what the solutions are? One of the more obvious clues would be if the visitors or entities with their profoundly advanced intellect arrive here in the backwoods of this galaxy and find us primitive humans flailing about and just happen by some strange coincidence to offer ideas, agendas, syntheses, and solutions very similar or identical to those currently pursued by the very upper crust of the 1% and all their state apparatus. Let me guess. If we don't correct course immediately and turn control over to some high priest class of experts with all the answers regarding our best interest, humanity is doomed for all eternity. Oh, and by the way, it's all your fault, humans. And once you know it, the same people, the same interests, the same families would remain at the top of the pyramid. They'll retain the control, they'll gain power and wealth, and we the people will be paying for it. Sound about right? Yeah, well, it's pretty much never not that. Here's another clue. If the entity suggests that we need to do away with the idea of sovereignty in favor of some massive overarching global management structure, I would say they're likely nothing more than another part of the existing control system. If they further the idea that the individual consciousness is largely inconsequential and should be overlooked in favor of the herd, and that much of the collectivist structure put in place by the kings of the earth with the money they've stolen from the people should remain in place, I would be extremely critical of the ET's motivations. If the entity suggests that the people become a homogenized, indoctrinated, conditioned herd of obedient drones as an answer to the world's problems, they should be considered hostile rather than benevolent. If they are aware of our history in the slightest, they should be undeniably aware that it is exactly these ideas that have led to the sorry fact that our history is full of oppression and that freedom is a road seldom traveled by the multitudes. For them to dismiss and ignore this fact would be evidence that these are entities of either advanced ignorance, of extreme malevolence, or both. Stanton Friedman is a relatively popular and respected voice in the UFO community. He was, I think, the first civilian researcher of the Roswell incident in 1947, and I think he's been going strong since that time. He has made some comments that I find extremely well related to the above concerns. When discussing how extraterrestrials may view humans or humanity, Friedman offers that, well, we killed 50 million people and we destroyed 1,700 cities in World War II. He also referred to humanity by saying, we are not the good guys, and for this reason, the ETs haven't made open contact or sufficient contact. I just have to ask, who in the world is this we of whom you speak, Mr. Friedman? Do you actually believe that these beings of supposedly profound intelligence can't apprehend the simple fact that most of us have absolutely no connection whatsoever to those responsible for selling World War II, along with selling nearly every other war, including the endless wars on nouns, to the people? I find the suggestion of Friedman's to be so in tune with the rhetoric and the narratives of the elite that it appears to be nothing more than Psittacism, since it would seem to play right into the hands of the exact same people, the exact same powers, and the exact same agendas that Friedman would have us believe are hiding the truth from us. In the Club of Rome's book, The First Global Revolution, under the heading, The Common Enemy of Humanity is Man, we find an interesting quote. And I will tell you up front that I took the middle part of this quote out because while it speaks of pollution, global warming, famine, water shortage, it also says that these things are not the causes, but the symptoms. What is the real problem? Well, they conclude, in searching for a common enemy against whom we might unite, we came up with the idea that the real enemy then is humanity itself. Here are a couple other quotes and ideas from the same book, just to give a well-rounded picture of where we the people stand. In their minds, anyway. This is a quote. The ploy of finding a scapegoat is as old as mankind itself. When things become too difficult at home, divert attention to adventure abroad. Bring a divided nation together to face an outside enemy, either a real one or else one invented for the purpose. That's interesting. They also refer to the de facto erosion, or the reality of the erosion of sovereignty, and how it could be a positive trend toward a new global system. And how do they intend to achieve what they call a new global system? Well, I guess if not by consent, then by conquest and coercion, since they say, and I quote, "Democracy is no longer well suited to the tasks at hand." You don't matter, people. They just say you do.
The idea that humans are the enemy has been embedded in them for more than 2 generations.
So maybe we're dealing with ETs that are severely historically illiterate, or possibly the record-keeping process over decades or maybe even centuries of visitation and study was severely inadequate. I submit to you, my friends, that if ETs have been studying humanity and they miss this standard operating procedure, they should be wearing helmets, and not because they're piloting UFOs. Moving on to other clues of a potential royal fable of the extraterrestrial variety. As I mentioned earlier regarding transformative science, as some in the disclosure field are calling it, if they funnel these transformative technologies to the people, if this knowledge goes through the same filters of corporations, special interest groups, universities, and political plunderers and regulators, rather than exposing these ever-present fallacious, fraudulent power structures, bypassing them, and giving the power directly to the people, these entities couldn't possibly be very benevolent or very intelligent. Especially if we were talking about zero-point energy. If they can travel across the galaxy or between galaxies and yet haven't figured out how to allow for individuals to express and develop their unique innate form of existence independent of megalithic power structures, or worse, much worse, if they promote continued involuntary servitude to these structures, well, I think we can expect that nothing will be changing for the better unless you prefer a really cool pop culture and trending kind of slavery. And on top of that, another indication of a ploy or deception would be if, in the event of an ET disclosure, any who question the government, media, public opinion consensus stance on the presence and refuse to stick to the sanctioned narrative were summarily dismissed, marginalized, discredited, demonized, dehumanized, all the tricks that they use for having crazy and dangerous ideas. This is the oldest ploy in the book. If the people are required to accept the consensus of the disclosure on faith so the state can create another or add to an existing quasi-religious ideology, chances are we're simply being manipulated yet again. We cannot consider the potentials of such a profound occurrence without maintaining rational and critical thought and taking into account how such events are utilized. Rahm Emanuel stated that no good crisis should be wasted, but rather used to do things that they couldn't usually get away with. Essentially, he's talking about things that they can only get away with if greater uncertainty and fear exists among the people. See, a crisis opens people up, and there are always those who exploit this lowered resistance, like a virus. Rahm Emanuel recently asked who to patrol the streets of Chicago. Yeah, that would be the UN, the same UN that is looking for seamless control earlier mentioned, the same UN that believes your rights are what their experts say they are. UFO disclosure could be exactly the right crisis to facilitate the type of transformation the globalists are dreaming of. Hitler knew that if lying was part of your plan, it is best to make the lie so big that it lowers the resistance of the target population. To make them think, this has to be the truth. No one could lie so outrageously and horribly. Who would do that? But didn't Hitler succeed in convincing people to hate and dehumanize the unbelievers, the undesirables, and the unwanted? Yes, he did. And by continually whittling away at your intellectual self-defense, your capacity for critical thought, and then directing and molding public opinion in the absence of critical thought, in the void that it creates, it allows the same type of people, perhaps with a kinder, gentler machine gun hand, but with similar collectivist goals of tyranny and domination, to say, yes, we can. And get you to chant along, not realizing, or even caring in many cases, that what is meant is absolutely not, yes, you can, or yes, I can. In fact, suggestions of independence, personal accountability, and personal responsibility are soundly denounced, and the messengers aggressively disparaged by the man. You must cooperate or face exclusion from the evidently exclusive inclusivity. This is also known as what? Yeah, the status quo. So with that, I'm going to share with you 3 direct personal experiences I've had with UFOs. I have seen a UFO 3 times in my life, but 2 of those encounters involved the same type of UFO. These 2 incidents with the same type of craft were the most recent, and I think I'm going to begin with the first of those 2, which actually would be the second UFO that I've seen. So that might sound a little convoluted, but it's the only account I actually wrote down right after the event. I have included the aerial view of the exact area so you can have a better frame of reference. This is in a small town of about 5,000 people in the Pacific Northwest. I had walked down to like a dairy mart, which is like if you're not familiar with the Northwest, it's just a convenience store common to the area. This was around 11 o'clock in the evening on August 30th, 2010. It was a very clear summer night. The moon was about 3/4 full, but close to the eastern horizon, so it wasn't really detracting from my view of the stars above me. On my way back from the convenience store, as I walked south down the road, which was basically a highway going through this small town, I saw a glowing, flickering orange ball of light that looked like fire moving towards me, but kind of on the other side of the road, maybe 250, 300 yards ahead of me and closing. And it was moving very slowly, not more than 15 miles an hour, I'm guessing, and probably an altitude of around 200 feet. Now, this part is a little weird. As it got closer, I just stopped to watch it. I mean, I don't know, why not, right? You don't see something like that every day, so I was going to see what it did. And the object began to slow down gradually until it came to a complete stop right on the other side of the road from where I was. It's like I was just inside a parking lot of a library. And it just hovered there, flickering without making a sound for about 45 seconds or so. It didn't seem like an entire minute. Then it began moving to the east, this part's interesting too, moving directly away from my line of sight, gradually gaining altitude, in a low trajectory, in what I can only describe as a very, very smooth manner. It didn't take off fast, but very leisurely. However, as bright as it was, it disappeared from sight within 10 to 15 seconds, almost looking as though it was just getting smaller until it disappeared. It was very surreal. Then once it was gone, I just finished walking home and wrote down an account of the event. So that would be UFO number 2. UFO number 3 happened about a year and a few months later. Again, still in the Pacific Northwest. This time in broad daylight, I'm thinking around 4 o'clock in the afternoon. This was in the middle of a residential area in a much bigger town. And I saw the exact same type of UFO. I will also include an aerial view of this location so you can check it out. This time, however, I was not alone. I was actually with a very close friend of mine, the woman who is now my wife. I was on foot. She was riding my bike up ahead when I saw the object or craft approaching from the west as we were moving from south to north. It was an overcast day, and the clouds in the northwest, they can hang pretty low. So I believe it was at a similar altitude as a UFO from the previous year. But we were walking down a street that ends at a park in broad daylight. So I stopped to look, and I was standing in the street right outside someone's house. I remember there was a large window with its shade open, and you could see into the house, and I was thinking, like, wow, they might find it odd that someone is staring so intently at something kind of above their house. But no one really seemed to notice us at all, and it didn't seem like anyone else saw what we were seeing. But the object was moving exactly as I had remembered from the previous experience. Very slow, very smooth. I immediately got my wife's attention and told her to come and check this thing out. By the time she got to my position, the orange flickering ball had already gradually slowed down and come to a complete stop just a little to the west of us at an altitude of about 200 feet. Again, it remained motionless and silent and just hovered as we watched for less than a minute, it seemed, before this craft began moving back toward the west, almost directly away from our line of sight in the direction from which it approached, in the same gradual, smooth manner I had witnessed before until it was out of sight, which really didn't take long because it was soon obscured by trees this particular time. So in both of these incidents, I have no idea if the craft behaved the way it did as a reaction to be seen by us. It kind of seemed like that's what happened, but I have no way of knowing that for sure, and I would never suggest that it was obviously the case. It's just kind of what it really seemed like. And even if it did, who knows what that means? I mean, I was watching it, so maybe whomever was watching me back. I really don't have any idea. And no, there was no missing time, if any of you are thinking that. There's nothing at all of that nature. It was just a sighting. Nothing more weird than the sighting, I guess. But I have included a link to a very interesting UFO video. The aerial video, or the aerial vehicle in this video, bears no resemblance to the flickering orange orb or sphere that I saw, but the way this UFO moves is exactly the same as what I saw. So you'll have to watch it. Watch the way it moves directly away, and in such a smooth fashion. If you imagine the object in the video being enveloped by a spherical orange flame, it would essentially be what I saw on those two occasions. The movement is identical, and I was pretty stoked when I came across this video, and a little weirded out too. There would seem to be some connection between the two. And actually, the orange orb or flaming sphere is a somewhat common UFO that people report. And as I mentioned earlier, the accounts from the 1952 DC sighting included orange fireball type craft, so their appearance is nothing new, as well as some of the sightings by military pilots in World War II, a decade earlier. So maybe this is the same. Maybe this is the same type of thing. I really don't know. Really don't know. Now I'm going to share my very first experience, which occurred way back in the fall of 1987. Even though it's been over 30 years since this incident, I can still see it so clearly in my mind, and it is by far my favorite of the three sightings. I'm pretty sure this was sometime in September. This happened in a small town on the border between Nebraska and South Dakota. And usually by October it's pretty cold in the evening, and we were all pretty comfortable being outside after dark without being all bundled up, so that's why I say September. This was the first semester of my senior year, and our astronomy teacher had a cool assignment for his classes that included meeting at a local observatory one school night to observe some live astronomy. I think this could possibly make the date of this sighting somewhere around September 23rd, 1987, since there was a new moon, and it would have been a really good night to look through a telescope. So that's kind of an educated guess, but anyway, the teacher handed out worksheets, and we took our turns at the telescope and wrote down our observations. You know, the number of rings we counted around Saturn, moons around Jupiter, etc. As we finished, we waited outside for the rest of the students to complete their worksheets. And again, I'll include an aerial view of the area, highlight some of the details if I can. There were about 8 or so students, plus the teacher, all talking and just being typical high school students. The observatory sat on a raised area that overlooked one of the main streets going through town to the west of us, and most of us must have been facing that direction because everyone suddenly went silent as we saw this aerial vehicle move quickly through our field of vision from north to south at an altitude of, 150 to 200 feet. It wasn't really high up in the sky. It appeared to be not more than a couple blocks to the west of us. It was a triangular craft, triangular in shape, but it did not appear to be an equilateral triangle as I remember it, but rather a scalene. So every edge was a different length. It was traveling with its longest edge to the back and perpendicular to the ground. Now this is the weird part of this one. It has to get more weird, but the weirdest part, I should say, is that while the triangular shape was clear and obvious, There were no lights or any other discernible features because it was, for lack of a better term, cloaked, looking like a mirage or heat waves. So while the shape was very distinct, it was also to a large degree transparent, which means that we could have only been seeing it from the side, and its actual shape could have been different if seen as a whole. I have no idea. This also makes the question of distance a little harder to judge with certainty. So, I mean, who knows with these things? What I saw was a triangle-shaped patch of distorted, translucent sky moving at around, 100 miles an hour, maybe less. It made no sound whatsoever and was out of visual range in around, I'm guessing, 5 to 7 seconds. Like it was just passing through. It looked very much like the camouflage used in the Predator movies in a way. Maybe a little more smooth than that, but something of that nature. So yeah, that was the first UFO I saw over 3 decades ago. And it is also the last of the 3 experiences that I have to share. Now, having seen these strange things in our skies, it makes it impossible for me to simply look away from the UFO ET issue or pretend that I have not observed what I have observed. At the same time, it in no way makes me an expert or authority on the subject. Quite the contrary, it's left me with some very big questions. What does it mean? What exactly did I see in the sky? And how relevant is it to us down here on the ground? In what ways is it relevant? In the second part of this podcast, we will consider the actual experiences, mine as well as others, to see what questions arise and the degree to which they can be answered. There are many interesting avenues we could explore. Some we've mentioned, such as zero-point energy, genetics, possibly even mind control techniques. But there are also intriguing connections to meditation, entheogens, the psychedelic experience, transdimensional beings, or interdimensional beings as they are being called, and pretty much the entire cosmos of the human mind. So please do check back in to listen to the continuation of these considerations. However, as we start to catch sight of the conclusion of today's episode, I want to keep the focus firmly on the idea of the UFO ET phenomenon, because it is a very powerful idea. And it doesn't matter if you think it's all a hoax or if you are anxiously awaiting some sort of ET arrival. It is, in either case, a very powerful idea. And it's becoming an actual part of the great conversation. Speaking of the great conversation, in Plato's The Republic, the concept of the noble lie is discussed. We've mentioned it briefly. In The Story of Philosophy by Will Durant, he refers to it as the royal fable. The royal fable is precisely a powerful idea used as a form of control in order to homogenize the people around a central belief or faith. So just think about that. This is 2,500 years ago. It was understood then that by using powerful, grandiose, and we cannot forget sophisticated deceptions, the people are more easily managed without as much necessity for brute force, thereby circumventing much suspicion. However, the empty promises of a utopia, or we could call it heaven on earth, doesn't matter, are only powerful insofar as a sufficient percentage of the people put their faith in these big ideas of the common good. This is where public opinion management becomes crucial. But why? Why does this manipulation of public opinion become crucial? This is a major point. Because truth is not the objective. The truth is actually a hindrance to the objective. The public is merely given a paradigm by which they are expected to abide. In the Republic, we also find similar ideas regarding education as echoed by Bertrand Russell in his quote from earlier in this podcast. Within our recent history, there is an abundance of evidence that fantastically wealthy interests threw their resources behind the movement to change the education systems from the concept of cultivating our innate individual humanity and innate powers of reason to their fullest expression, and instead center them around a concept that is more akin to operant conditioning that views we the people as objects of stimulus and response. This was alluded to by Robert Hutchins in the 1953 book, The Great Conversation, which served as the introduction to a 54-volume set of the great books of the Western world, wherein he discussed the fact that the liberal education had been largely removed from the people 90 years prior to 1953, which in turn led to a great risk that the people could be treated as objects of propaganda, as he called it, because they had been thereby rendered largely irrational. In the minutes of the meetings of the massively powerful tax-exempt foundations, they speak plainly about using their immense resources to influence public opinion, even going so far as to infiltrate academia, with special focus on history and the sciences and extra special emphasis on the social sciences. And even if you haven't taken much time to study the history of American schooling, I'm sure you are familiar with the name John Dewey. You might find this interesting. In 1917, John Dewey had this to say: "Someone remarked that the best way to unite all the nations on this globe would be an attack from some other planet. In the face of such an alien enemy, people would respond with a sense of their unity of interest and purpose." Does that sound familiar at all? I mean, is there a script from which these people are reading? Now, in this light, Dewey goes on to say the following: "In spite of geographical distance, unlike speech, diverse religion, and hitherto independent aims, nations from every continent have formed what for the time being is nothing less than a world state, an immense cooperative action in behalf of civilization." Wow. 1917. So for over a century now, the public opinion campaign has been going in essentially the same direction. You must cooperate with the experts' conception of civilization. But why a century, do you think? Why so much time, not to mention the countless billions spent on this campaign? Because a population educated in line with independence doesn't readily allow it to be stolen from them without being first adequately schooled to give it up, to basically focus on a point on the wall and let it happen. And there are clear connections from John Dewey and the current schooling system to the immensely powerful influence of people like the Rockefellers. Connections as well to the Rothschild dynasty, whose own website lets you know they have been at the center of global financial markets for over 200 years. Also to the British Empire, on which the sun never set, that openly allowed slavery, upon which the sun never set, until 1833. And that's not the British people, mind you, but the British crown, you know, those people who use their media puppets to dangle their royal nuptials in your face. Yeah, they're better than us because they were born. See, that's the epitome of the royal fable right there. We previously mentioned the racist Cecil Rhodes, who thought Africans should be treated as children, and who left his vast blood diamond money to Lord Rothschild to be used to undermine America and the idea of sovereignty and bring it back under British control. A sentiment actually echoed by the powerful tax-exempt foundations in the years thereafter. This topic is far too deep to wade into here, so I will include in the notes to this podcast an incredible 5-hour interview with retired educator John Taylor Gatto, conducted by corporate whistleblower Richard Andrew Grove. It is a great place to start to familiarize yourself with the well-hidden history that Mr. Gatto calls your birthright. Therein, Gatto also refers to an, quote, ominous continuity of major minds, unquote, with a great deal of influence stretching far back through time, at least as far as the ideas put forth by Plato. Now, around which idea do you suppose this continuity of major minds has been based for at least 2.5 millennia? We were just talking about it a little bit ago. It is the big idea that the threat to humanity, the danger to humanity, the enemy of humanity is you horrible humans. That's 2,500 years, people. The same royal fable, the same noble lie. 2,500 years and we are being fed the same recycled idea which we are expected to accept like baby birds in the nest with our mouths agape, ready to gleefully swallow all that is regurgitated from on high. And guess what it tastes like? It tastes just like control. Imagine that. But it is my sincere belief that the aforementioned scientific impact on society has not been quite so successful. Fortunately, there are still those with the capacity for critical thought to realize that we, the common people, too often live at the whim and highly conditional mercy of this ominous continuity, and our numbers must and will continue to grow. Of course, if we accept their old stale royal fable, we may be allowed inclusivity to the grand position of obsequious slave or pandering sycophant as a cog, a small piece of a collective pawn in their grand global game of chess. However, if we strive for this relatively new idea of individual liberty, this very recent tolerance and acceptance of individual consciousness, we will be perceived as nothing more than the dust that draws attention to the grand chessboard upon which they operate, the dust that must be swept away by their xenophobic institutions of higher indoctrination so they can successfully hide behind their fabricated pawns. Perhaps some of you may feel that I'm being a bit overzealous in my banging the drums against the royal fable, public opinion, and the common good. But it is extremely important to look at the big picture here so we can observe the relationship to the UFO ET disclosure movement. You, friends, deserve the historical context because it leads directly to the following disclosure I am going to share that just may be the most important fundamental disclosure. Toward that end, I ask you, what is one of the most prominent themes running through the UFO ET disclosure movement right now? You got it. You humans are the worst. The scourge of the galaxy, maybe even the scourge of the universe. That's why the ETs don't just plainly come and say hello, and they won't. Not until you understand, or are close enough to understanding, that you are pathetic and disgusting humans. Did you know that all war is your fault? Yeah, you. Don't look around. It's you. It's not the grand chess players, not those who consider themselves the elect, the justified sinners, the experts, not the supremacists waving the royal nuptials at us. Even if you're just some innocent bystanders at a funeral and you get blown off the face of the planet, guess what? Still your fault. It's you abhorrent carbon-based pollution machines. Oh yeah. Don't you know that global pollution is all your fault? Well, it is. I know you're just trying to scrape by working at the grocery store or the office, but somehow you still found the time to make a truly horrible mess of the planet. Because it's certainly not those who turn the gears of and profit from the military-industrial complex, certainly not any of its commanders-in-chief, not those who own the 90-gallon-per-mile super cargo ships that run 24/7, 365. It couldn't be those who genetically poison our food, not those rats outside the maze who see us as rats inside the maze, not those who will reap massive profits off of pollution through a carbon trading scheme. Not them. Nope. It's you. Did you also know that you are responsible for all oppression here on Earth as well? Not those who are at the center of global financial markets for 200 years, and not their relatively small group of 6,000 or so associates in their superclass. No, see, those are our philanthropists, you useless eater. It's you. It's not giant self-serving bureaucracies. It's not the institutions of higher indoctrination. Not those who believe that you need to be under constant surveillance for the greater good. Obviously, it could never be the destructive mythological state, and it couldn't possibly be the cold, calculating purveyors of persistent panopticonic collusion. No, no, and no. It's you. It's us. Look, people. We are going to be approaching 3 millennia before too long. Can you attempt to wrap your puny mind around this fact while you're sitting there wasting oxygen? Before long, it'll be 3,000 years that our betters have been trying to bludgeon this into our heads, so we had best get it through our thick, stupid human skulls already. We suck, and we need to be managed. How utterly silly. Again, if we are to believe that this is the intergalactic message from deep space, we are, first of all, in very big trouble, and next, at the very least, dealing with severely mentally deficient ETs. It would be much easier to believe that if they're not mentally inhibited, they are malevolent and diabolical, but benevolence and understanding, that's not even showing up on the radar. But I'm sure it's just a big coincidence, right? We had better hope so, especially with all the military intelligence personnel involved. For instance, Charles Douglas Jackson worked in psychological warfare as an expert in propaganda for the Office of Strategic Services, and also as a deputy chief of the Psychological Warfare Division of the, get this because this is a real thing during World War II, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. But with such an intriguing background, he was able to find work after World War II, working for both Time Life magazine and Fortune magazine. Imagine that. Do you think this connection, or at the very least this juxtaposition of psychological warfare to media, is noteworthy? Mr. Jackson later bought the Zapruder film of the Kennedy assassination for Time Life to keep it, nice and safe from we the people and our prying eyes. Again, psychological warfare expert working closely with the media in a very sensitive situation. Might that be something worthy of your critical thought? I would suggest that there is no good reason to remain ignorant of it. C.D. Jackson has also come up in relation to the Barney and Betty Hill UFO abduction case. There is some indication that he and someone named Robert Holman conducted interviews with the Hills in connection with the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomenon. I didn't even know if there was such a committee back in the 50s and 60s, did you? Anyway, a NICAP report dated August 30th, 1965 by Robert Webb claims that Jackson and Holman interviewed the Hills on November 25th, 1961, though it also claims that both men worked for IBM. I could find no record of either of them in relation to IBM. But if any of you have any evidence of this connection, I would love to see it. So was this a different C.D. Jackson, or was he possibly using IBM as a cover story? I have no idea. Incidentally, IBM has been implicated as having been in business with Nazi Germany by providing solutions to their, shall we say, social management challenges. So maybe there had been some previous relationship during Jackson's time in psychological operations. Jackson did, in fact, help to establish the extremely secretive Bilderberg Group and facilitated U.S. participation in it, so IBM or not, he is still part of the global cooperation and collaboration with which you must participate. And hey, kind of sounds like the space aliens need your cooperation too, right? Now, as the Rockefeller philanthropists were gearing up to profit from more than one side of World War II, they were also funding public opinion research at Princeton, establishing the Office of Public Opinion Research. They went on to fund other related studies of media, including radio and the press, as well as psychological warfare studies at Yale related to attitude change and persuasion, interestingly. It's not surprising to note then that the Rockefeller Foundation was funding the Princeton Radio Project and also funding fellowships at CBS when Orson Welles gave a presentation of H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds in 1938. And then in the month that followed, interviews with listeners were conducted and provided to CBS. The interviews were analyzed and included in Hadley Cantrill's The Invasion from Mars, a study of the psychology of panic, published in 1940. Cantrill was also the editor of Public Opinion Quarterly. He was part of the Rockefeller-funded Princeton Radio Project, and he was also a former roommate of Nelson Rockefeller at Dartmouth. Interesting connections there. In addition, H.G. Wells, a Fabian socialist, also wrote a book called The Open Conspiracy, which he states is an open and declared intention to gradually implement a world government. Wells says that this conspiracy should not be seen as a single organization, but as a conception of life. Conception, in this sense, being the sum of a person's ideas and beliefs concerning something. Another term for this is the German concept of Weltanschauungskrieg, which is worldview warfare or worldview attack. So how is it that the UFO ET disclosure movement finds itself with the same worldview as the superclass of immense wealth, that very upper crust of the so-called 1%, which has the same conception of life that has been used to maintain the status quo domination of we the people for at least 2,500 years, probably longer? Now that is a disclosure worthy of your attention and critical thought. This brings us to a very appropriate way to finish off the first part of episode number 1 here on the You Have the Con podcast. Why do you think this would be such a long-standing worldview that is imposed upon the people? Why is there this commonly held belief among influential minds stretching back through history that makes the common people the problem, the enemy? Remember, these are influential minds, minds that influence people, public opinion, and therefore policy. Why is public opinion so often directed to target, well, the public? Why does the common good always involve a suppression of we the people? Because we have something so powerful, so profound, that its very existence is a threat to oppressors and those who seek to enslave our minds. Your inherent freedom, your sovereignty, your unique consciousness. Your personal sovereignty must be belittled and circumvented, otherwise we will be impossible to manage, control, and enslave. But you see, our sovereignty is so undeniably innate that if it is forcibly taken, we have a natural drive to resist, to fight back, and escape. So in order to not lose herds of human resources, those who presume to be our managers resort to training fleas. Let me explain. And this lends to our disclosure discussion, since there are those who truly believe in ET visitation who postulate that humanity is so primitive that we are likely viewed by extraterrestrials as insects or bugs. So here's another thing that the ETs may have in common with the state or the man, and its affinity and proclivity for using animal training or herd management techniques on us humans. Training fleas is a matter of breaking their will. This is done by placing them in a covered container. The fleas jump but keep hitting the ceiling. In time, the fleas begin to identify with the ceiling. Once this is accomplished, the cover can be removed and the fleas will no longer jump high enough to escape. The ceiling is now part of them. The perceived yet non-existent limitation is now part of their identity. We will not explore this concept in depth in today's podcast, but I'm sure if you ponder it on your own, you'll begin to notice how this could be used to limit and divide we the people. Of course, we rational humans react very quickly and negatively to overt physical limitation and or restraint. So this flea training is done gradually with public schooling and public opinion management. As Rockefeller associate Frederick T. Gates stated in 1913 regarding their General Education Board, "In our dream we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our molding hand." You see, in their dreams, it is in our best interest if we are docile, if we are subservient or cooperative with their common good. Even so, our sovereignty is so intrinsic to our humanity that there is still a negative reaction in the form of frustration with unjustified limitations. As John Taylor Gatto has also pointed out, many of those who presume to be our managers are extremely well versed in human nature, so this point is not lost on them nor their molding hands. Therefore, this frustration and potential anger also become very effective tools. In the past, I've been a residential counselor for young men in corrections with substance abuse issues. One of the groups I led was anger management. Did you know that when you are operating out of anger, your mind functions well below its normal capacity? Up to 70% below its normal capacity for rational and critical thought. What an outstanding environment in which to direct public opinion and manipulate the people into cooperation. Zbigniew Brzezinski, a foreign policy advisor to and handler of presidents, in his 1970 book, Between Two Ages, refers to sovereignty as a fiction. The namesake of his book is a quote from Steppenwolf by Hermann Hesse, which reads, "Human life is reduced to real suffering, to hell, only when two ages, two cultures, and religions overlap. There are times when a whole generation is caught in this way, between two ages, two modes of life, with the consequence that it loses all power to understand itself and has no standard, no security, no simple acquiescence." If you will recall, we spoke of how these differences, religion, culture, belief, ideology, etc., are most often turned into clashes by those who seek to divide and conquer due to a vested interest in controlling we the people. It is very common throughout history for the people to live in harmony even though they differ in their beliefs. This is not uncommon. This is what Hess means by simple acquiescence. This is what is called liberality by definition, in contrast to how it is often used today.
You keep using the word. I don't think it means what you think it means.
However, if people can be made to feel as though they are oppressed or threatened by other beliefs or ideas, they can give way to astonishment or fear and be led very easily to anger, then hatred, then violence. Virtue and civility are cast aside. Then those who have most facilitated the clash capitalize on the chaos that ensues. Then they put on their philanthropist facade and presume to be our saviors so that they can thereby become our managers or masters. People like Brzezinski do not devise and work their machinations alone, however. He was simply fulfilling his part of the open conspiracy, as was H.G. Wells, the Fabian wolf in sheep's clothing, who also wrote a book entitled The New World Order. George H.W. Bush praised this New World Order, so did Bill Clinton. Obama used the phrase international order, as was used by the Council on Foreign Relations. And since we've been speaking of cooperation and collaboration, Open Society Nazi collaborator George Soros routinely uses his immense wealth for exactly this anti-sovereignty purpose, and has done so in Greece, Israel, Africa, Malaysia, England, and even currently in the United States, while fulfilling his part of creating what he and his profoundly wealthy superclass accomplices call a New World Order. I know, this New World Order talk is crazy talk, but I guess they get a pass because these elderly men of European descent have lots and lots and lots of money, and many people, even those who claim to resist, tend to sell out pretty darn easy. And the superclass knows they can always count on those people to do just that. At this point, some may say, well, these immensely wealthy factions of extremely powerful people are only talking about national sovereignty, not personal sovereignty. Remember the UN's seamless control we addressed earlier? Under Article 29 in the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, their proclamation of what rights you will be allowed, we find that in the end, this is a quote, "These rights and freedoms may in no way be exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations." End quote. You are literally being told point blank that your rights are subservient to the UN's international order agendas. You must cooperate, as Edward Bernays stated. You must accept that you need to be lied to in order to accept what the solutions are, as Al Gore stated, remember? The people will not be allowed to know how or from where their convictions arise. You and your unique consciousness then become obstacles if you will not accept their lies and manipulation. As stated in 1934 in the book An Outline of Educational Psychology, the situation response formula is adequate to cover learning of any sort, and the really influential factors in learning are readiness of the neurons, sequence in time, belongingness, and satisfying consequences. That means you are seen as an object of stimulus and response, or an object of propaganda, as noted by Robert Hutchins, which we discussed earlier. Our neurons must be conditioned on the appropriate schedule to manipulate us into acceptance of or even religious fervor for inclusivity in their construct so as to satisfy their criteria. Or as B.F. Skinner's 1970 book suggests with its title alone, Beyond Freedom and Dignity. The same year geopolitical pawnbroker Brzezinski was suggesting that sovereignty doesn't exist, Skinner was suggesting that your freedom and dignity, i.e. your humanity and consciousness, are the problem and must be circumvented or mitigated. So what do the experts say that the solutions are? Giving up your sovereignty, your personal sovereignty. Or as Stephen Hawking more recently said to top it off, It is hard to imagine how free will can operate if our behavior is determined by physical law. So it seems that we are no more than biological machines and that free will is just an illusion. Wow. Did wisdom get spaghettified and disappear into a theoretical cosmological construct from which there is no escape? Or was Hawking being used as a puppet by far smaller minds in his later years? Because it would appear that, scientifically speaking, according to some of the most influential minds of our times, you are simply a machine in need of programming.
Choice. The problem is choice.
If your free will is illusory, isn't your consciousness or self-awareness also an illusion? If there is no self-awareness, how can there be self-ownership? So, what does our humanity mean, scientifically speaking? It means property. It means resource. It means slave. Just how much of the people's resources, how many of the people's lives have been stolen and squandered again and again and again, only to ceaselessly arrive at and settle upon the same royal fable, the same status quo that has been propagated, perpetrated, and perpetuated for at least 25 centuries. And now, not only do we have to contend with the wealthiest, most powerful, most influential parasites of our time right here on Earth, if you accept the conclusions of many of the UFO experts and researchers, we may also have to deal with intra- and or intergalactic parasites who will come to join our presuming masters to raise the collectivist castigation of humanity to a cosmological cacophony. I'm sorry, but the idea is being expressed here that there are beings of highly advanced intellect with the capacity for galactic travel, yet simultaneously lack the capacity to notice the ever-present royal fable, status quo, dominating over humanity for thousands of years, are diametrically opposed ideas. It's nearly schizophrenic to hold them both simultaneously in the mind, in my opinion. Dr. Stephen Greer, who we mentioned earlier of the Disclosure Project, which goes back to the early 1990s, has repeatedly stated that science has regularly been used to deceive and mislead the people for decades. I give him a lot of credit for having the courage to point that out, since doing so can readily lead to aggressive religious fervor, is what I would call it. And as we have already briefly discussed regarding climate change, there is ample evidence that this is an ongoing issue. Science is often used to elicit belief and faith to further agendas rather than truth. But Dr. Greer also makes the claim that there is no evidence that these life forms from elsewhere are hostile towards us, but there's a great deal of evidence that they are concerned with our hostility. Again, sound familiar? This is no different than Stanton Friedman's comments to the effect that we, humanity, are not the good guys. This is where I have to vehemently disagree. I do not, nor have I ever associated with hostile people. So when you say our hostility or we are not the good guys, about whom exactly are you speaking? Do you think I'm hostile? Are you hostile, Greer? Are you hostile, Friedman? How about you, dear listener? Are you hostile? Should you be included in this inclusivity? How many of the wars constructed by the cooperative collaborators have you been instrumental in facilitating? How much of your money and effort have you knowingly and willingly thrown behind efforts to aggressively attack the sovereignty of people or nations? What Greer is doing, what Friedman is doing, this is collectivism, this lumping of all people together based on the lowest common denominator. Aside from being quite literally racist against the entire human race, it is totalitarianism because it seeks to subjugate the mind, enslave the mind. This is exactly the ideology that victimizes and lays waste to humanity through its wars, regardless of whether they're called crusades or holy wars or some other form of imposed moral imperative that encourages humans to dehumanize humans. This is exactly the ideology that enslaves minds through its tribunals or inquisitions or any other similar punishment of heretics, i.e., those who refuse to subjugate their minds to the collective. I know, there you go again. Just being so negative. I guess I'm not being very nice and cooperative with those who like to arrange such lovely, inclusive social gatherings of diversity and equality in their internment camps, sometimes in their labor camps, or possibly a concentration camp, and even sometimes in a death camp. Isn't it amazing how much collectivists love that kind of camping, right? But of course, it's all for the common good of humanity, all in the best interests of humanity. I would strongly suggest to you again, my friends, any entities of a highly advanced intellect would quite obviously be more than capable of recognizing the xenophobic nature of this line of thought to which Greer and Stanton and many others cling in opposition of the individual. Any creature with the capacity for reason on this planet, if one cares to look, can clearly see that human history is a nearly unbroken line of subjugation of the mind to the collective. The more one looks, the more apparent this becomes. And that's just assuming you're a horrible and hostile human hovering slightly higher than other hominids. But you see, we are supposed to be talking about entities from elsewhere of advanced rational capacity. So how is it possible that their advanced rational capacity leads them to, well, basically racism against the entire population of Earth? When Greer says ETs are concerned about our hostility, there's no distinction made between the hostile and those who suffer due to hostility. Sorry to those of us who have no predilection for hostility, no tendencies toward hostility. Even if we prefer to defend others in the face of hostility, the ETs are just going to assume that since you're human, you're obviously part of the problem. It reminds me of that ridiculous idea that terrorists despise your freedom, so we'll have to take away some of your freedom, and we'll do it with something called a Patriot Act to be semantically tactical. The interests in both of these scenarios would seem to be conflicted. If we assume all humans are hostile, we also accuse all those who would gladly stand against hostility. That's conflicted. If we say we have to relinquish freedoms because our fabricated enemies despise our freedom, that is also conflicted. We've briefly discussed the immensely wealthy and powerful tax-exempt foundation, and it's interesting to note that Norman Dodd, who was given permission to study the minutes of their meetings, was told by one of the foundation's presidents that the foundations were actually working specifically toward the institutionalizing of conflicting interests. That's noteworthy on its own, but certainly in the context of this topic. Of course, among the foundations working towards this goal is the Rockefeller Foundation. Just who do we find behind Dr. Greer and Project Starlight? One Lawrence Rockefeller. Lawrence funded Project Starlight as part of the Rockefeller Initiative, which sought to facilitate disclosure in the midst of using their profound wealth to subjugate our minds within a totalitarian world state. Or as was called in the 1961 Rockefeller Panel Report, called Prospect for America, it was called a New World Order. Lawrence was part of that panel. So round and round we go. And actually, John Podesta, with whom Tom DeLonge exchanged some emails in relation to the To the Stars Academy, you'll remember, was also part of the Rockefeller Initiative, as were Hillary and Bill. So there is an interconnection which could imply that the global citizens referred to by the To the Stars Academy's mission statement actually does mean citizens of this collectivist world state John Dewey spoke of. Citizens of the international order spoken of by the Council on Foreign Relations and Obama, of the New World Order of Bush, Clinton, H.G. Wells, Carnegie, Rockefeller, so on and so forth, up to and evidently including the entities from elsewhere, as Dr. Greer articulates. Well, what a bunch of kook nut, whack job, tinfoil hat, open conspiracy theorists they must be. So while there is a long-standing and concerted global effort to attack national sovereignty, we must understand that this is only a broader aspect and a stepping stone of the total war being waged against the primary target, your individual sovereignty, your mind. That is the ultimate goal, subjugation of your mind to the world collective. That is the status quo for millennia. But now the grand chessboard is the entire Earth. The Panopticonic collusion is global. Through time, the royal fable changes but little. The common good, the common enemy, the best interests of humanity, the delusional utopian fantasy to which you must bow and for which you must dehumanize heretics and non-believers, whether they be friends or neighbors, brothers or sisters, sons or daughters, mothers or fathers. And you know, it really doesn't matter if the globalists who despise your individual consciousness use some sort of a utopian fantasy, or if you want to take the letter T out of utopian and insert the letter F for a brand spanking new utopian fantasy based on the same old royal fable. What an excellent way this would be to update and repackage the public opinion campaign for this ancient status quo. And how is public opinion created, mitigated, and manipulated? From where do the influential minds presume to win control of our hearts and minds? In 1961, a newsletter put out by former FBI agent Dan Smoot said this about molding a docile public. In what was called the Dan Smoot Report, this was July 17th, 1961. The report says, "The Council on Foreign Relations is the invisible government of the United States by virtue of the fact that members of the Council occupy key posts in the executive branch of government from the presidency downward. By its own efforts and through many interlocking organizations, the Council on Foreign Relations also virtually controls public opinion in the United States." It sounds like Mr. Smoot was familiar with the words of Edward Bernays when he calls the CFR the invisible government in relation to its capacity to control public opinion and manipulate the people into cooperation. The Council on Foreign Relations exists because of the efforts of imperialist, racist oppressor Cecil Rhodes, who, according to Bill Clinton's mentor, Carroll Quigley, established a network of influential, like-minded social reformers with the goal of global empire. From Cecil Rhodes, Lord Milner, Lord Balfour, who will come up in the next episode, also Lord Rothschild and others with similar presumptuous, supremacist, make-pretend titles, we find a direct connection to the current attempt to make an end run around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece, as Council on Foreign Relations member Richard Gardner stated. So this is a large part of the ominous continuity of major influential minds. This is the power structure that will tell us what liberty, equality, and fraternity we will be allowed. This is Panopticonic collusion, working toward their new world order, their new international order, or their world state. Quigley, after pointing out that the U.S. branch of Rhodes' network was a front for J.P. Morgan and Company, called the Council on Foreign Relations, goes on to note, "On this basis, which was originally financial and goes back to George Peabody, there grew up in the 20th century a power structure between London and New York which penetrated deeply into university life, the press, and the practice of foreign policy. In England, the center was the Round Table Group, while in the United States, it was J.P. Morgan and Company or its local branches in Boston, Philadelphia, and Cleveland. The American branch of this English establishment exerted much of its influence through 5 American newspapers: the New York Times, New York Herald Tribune, Christian Science Monitor, the Washington Post, and the lamented Boston Evening Transcript. In fact, the editor of the Christian Science Monitor was the chief American correspondent. It might be mentioned that the existence of this Wall Street Anglo-American axis is quite obvious once it is pointed out." End quote. Quigley also shows how the tax-exempt foundations like Carnegie and Rockefeller and their hopes for a docile public are intimately connected with this pursuit of global imperialism. They are monopolists, so collectivism is the goal, the purpose of their royal fable of the common good. This is what history, our birthright, clearly indicates. It should make us wonder, when we have these same people involved with the plan to destroy national sovereignty for their global empire connected to and even funding the so-called disclosure movement. People who use academia and the media as their tools to enslave minds, to destroy your national sovereignty, to destroy your humanity under the guise of saving humanity. From their own mouths, they say it outright. They want you docile. So when John Dewey gives the following perhaps ostensible warning, in retrospect, it appears to be more of a game plan. John Dewey says this: "A ruling class and the government may use the schools to inculcate particular doctrines in plastic minds, to suppress freedom of inquiry, to turn out minds in a common mold, and a mold favorable to their own special interest. That was in his book, Ethics, 1908. The royal fable is essentially a call to collective religious faith. Public opinion is used to condition people to put their faith in those who tell us what the solutions are. To do this, they have to get you to give way to astonishment, as Terence McKenna put it. That's the crisis. That's the fear. Can you imagine the astonishment of a major UFO event? Let's go back to my first experience in 1987. Incidentally, I think I said the craft was moving from north to south, but it was actually moving from south to north. I just wanted to clear that part up. Anyway, immediately after that sighting, I was anxious to discuss it with friends who saw exactly what I saw. Some of them seemed to not want to discuss it at all. If I remember correctly, some appeared to want to dismiss the experience entirely. Cognitive dissonance is something with which we must all contend, but is also something that can be used against us. In that moment, as Rahm Emanuel said, they can get people to accept things they otherwise would not consider. They want to remove the obstacle of your critical thought, your consciousness. This is a common tactic of collectivism, the winning of hearts and minds. As Ludwig von Mises said about what he considered to be a most insidious form of collectivism back in 1908. Von Mises says that logic and reasoning, which might show the absurdity of such dreams of bliss and revenge, are to be thrust aside. Let's pause here. This is important to understand. It's not simply about a blissful utopia. It's also about revenge and punishment of those perceived to be obstacles to the royal fable. So the docile public they seek doesn't necessarily mean a civil public. Managers don't like to get their hands dirty, so they always use their pawns on the grand chessboard to get out there and resist the enemy, which is, again, your humanity. Mises continues. Marxism is thus the most radical of all reactions against the reign of scientific thought over life and action established by rationalism. It is against logic, against science, and against the activity of thought itself. Its outstanding principle is a prohibition of thought and inquiry, especially as applied to the institutions and workings of a socialist economy. In the U.S. institutions of higher indoctrination, this form of totalitarianism is totally trending today. Docile and malleable minds are being molded by collectivism. The results are clear by the irrationality on the level of the streets. People who consider themselves educated are giving way to astonishment due to a lack of wisdom, and the predictable fear, anger, and hatred and oppression follow along. We briefly mentioned how Norman Dodd was told by the president of the Ford Foundation that they were using their vast wealth to institute conflicting interests. That can only be done after reason and critical thought have been greatly diminished, and many people are easily used as objects of stimulus and response, or objects of propaganda. Let's look at some examples of this. Just a few years ago, there was a big campaign against bullying, if you'll remember. Now, this is just a few years later, political leaders, and I would use the term overseers, who presented themselves as against bullying are actually encouraging bullying or verbal attacks and physical violence and suggesting that discourse, i.e. reason, is to be avoided in favor of these attacks. Media puppets follow along. There was a presidential campaign that stated with self-righteous indignation, "The children are watching," to feign, a moral high ground. Followed directly by what? By attacks full of profanity, vulgarity, destruction of private property, uncivilized behavior of all kinds, including physical attacks. A performer suggested that the First Lady be raped for financial gain, etc. All by the same exact group of people who claim to stand for humanity. This is seen and promoted as acceptable behavior by so-called educators, so-called professors, politicians, and so-called media. A political couple who, incidentally, claim to support disclosure, we've mentioned them before, and are also portrayed with public opinion manipulation as defenders of the people, said about Obama, years ago, this guy would be getting us coffee, or made a complaint that you only endorsed him, Obama, because he's black. And when their true feelings come out, they suggest that they should only be listening to white people. Take a listen.
Yeah, well, respectfully, if that is your position, then I will talk only to white people about how we are going to deal with the very real problems.
That's not what I mean. That's not what I mean.
No.
But
Then these people are somehow exalted, while opponents who say anything approaching that are ceaselessly castigated as the worst humans on the planet. We've gone from the authentic liberal ideal of sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me, to the totalitarian ideal called liberalism. They said bad words, hit them with sticks and stones, and sometimes bottles of feces and urine, which is, of course, the antithesis of liberalism, the antithesis of liberty. It is totalitarianism. But of course, it's for the common good, right? They really do love to treat us like idiots and slaves, don't they? I would say absolutely and unequivocally that this is perverse. Wouldn't you just love to ask some of those who presume to be our handlers the question, is this not oppression and slavery?
It depends upon what the meaning of the word is.
Wait, what?
It depends upon what the meaning of the word is.
Wow. I'm afraid that is what we're up against, my friends. That is why coming to the realization and understanding of how your individual consciousness is being manipulated and subjugated is so crucial, and no less so when considering UFO ET disclosure, since we can connect the dots from the ideology and those involved to those who desperately need you to give up national sovereignty and, more importantly, your individual sovereignty in the name of humanity, in the name of liberty, equality, and fraternity. If you'll remember, the word fraternity can have religious connotations. In our time, the word used in the same manner and for the same purposes is inclusivity, as we've talked about. Also, in our present time, another word is used toward the same ends. That word is universal. For example, the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that ironically excludes any rights you may possess that threaten its concept of inclusivity. Also, we hear of universal health care. It's another example. And also the universal slave wage Zuckerberg's handlers had him suggest recently. In the past, another word was used for the same goals of imperial domination that is simply another word meaning universal. That word is Catholic. So who knows? I don't know. Maybe the giant hats worn by Catholic hierarchy were inspired by the giant heads of aliens, right? But I don't say that to disparage Catholics, not at all. I say it to disparage the mental subjugation intrinsic to collectivism, the religious fervor it cultivates, the irrationality, and therefore the violence it fosters. That brings us back to the intersection of those three ideas I mentioned at the beginning. Those ideas being that the cosmos is stranger and more magnificent than we can suppose, that we don't know 1/1,000,000th of 1% about anything, and that true wisdom is realizing that you know nothing. These ideas are not to say that nothing is knowable or capable of being known. These ideas are to demonstrate that there is so much to be known in the world and in the cosmos, and so much that is routinely occulted or hidden, or simply left out of the equation altogether. What we need is not more experts. What we need is personal exploration. What we need is not another imposed ideology, but the free flow of ideas. For all the accumulated knowledge of humankind, we have made only the faintest smudge on the surface of our understanding of reality. The royal fable, that old stale status quo, is all about convincing enough people that they possess the absolute and final truth, and that any and all heretics must be compelled or coerced into conformity or severely punished for not bowing down as ordered. Invariably, this is done with the specific purpose of circumventing self-ownership and subjugating the people. we should also avoid being confused or influenced by the titles those who presume to subjugate and manage us call themselves, or the inflated credentials they stand upon. Whether they believe themselves to be royalty or call themselves the elect, or believe that they are the justified sinners, doesn't matter. Maybe they consider themselves part of the favored races that people like Darwin and Rhodes wanted to preserve and further. However, it's much worse and much more insidious than overt supremacy, because a direct line can be traced from today's university indoctrination back through the power structure written about by Carroll Quigley that deeply penetrated into university life, the press, and foreign policy. From there, going back through Cecil Rhodes and his network, all the way back to a trick used by Orthagoras in 676 BC. This old trick is actually related to the training of fleas we briefly discussed. It works by convincing a particular group of people that they are victims of exploitation and oppression, so they can be used as unwitting slaves, serving the quests of those whose only true concerns are power and subjugation and assimilation. Might this be where the British Empire got the idea of supporting the weaker power or the underdog in order to attack the greater power, which was actually first explained in 1513 by Cardinal Wolsey, who said this, and I quote, "Never throw your power to the side of the strong, but create disunity. Create a balance of power by siding with the weak." However, this balance of power is not in the interest of equality or liberty, as I'm sure they claimed, but rather in the interest of large-scale anarchy, in the interest of creating and using a crisis, as Rahm Emanuel would, in order to do what? Divide and rule. In a word, subjugation.
We have only to remove those who oppose us.
The horsemen took your land. They drove your people into the hills to scratch a living off rocks. Murderers! Take back the lands they stole from you. Burn every village!
I would say that there were aspects of the same tactic that actually led to the racial atrocities of Rwanda. Today we have this superclass of managers, the so-called philanthropists and or social reformers, as they like to call themselves, using the exact same tricks, ploys, and deceptions. What used to be called rule by divine right is simply called the consensus of expert. So it doesn't matter what common good or common enemy they conjure up and elevate to a godlike status through the use of schooling that produces useful, docile human resources whose opinions and habits can be manipulated to the point that they police themselves. It's going on right now in front of our very eyes. Logical fallacies, such as disparaging labels and personal attacks, appeals to popularity, appeals to strength in numbers, or altruism, are all used and accepted as reasoning points and rational thought, and supported by media and universities. As we have already discussed, this is nothing new, not by any stretch of the imagination. Throughout history, those who seek control through mental slavery use the same methods. Like Marx and Immanuel Kant before him, they're willing to destroy inquiry, reason, and thought in order to preserve their gods. This is the environment in which these strange sightings and experiences are occurring, and in which the disclosure movement is gaining popularity. Many people's focus has been fixated on the superficial characteristics of our shared humanity in order to get them to turn over control of the most crucial and important characteristic, their minds and thoughts. Once this has happened, it's a simple thing to encourage them to use coercion and violence in attempts to force others to do the same, to subjugate themselves. Your individual consciousness is the target, once again. The same status quo. The very foundation of humanity, your mind, your very being, is under attack in the name of humanity. The same royal fable. If there are actually highly advanced, benevolent ETs piloting these UFOs in our skies that honestly and genuinely care about humanity, they would already know these facts, and their first act would be to expose these parasitic predators. However, the evidence appears to show a connection between these parasites and the disclosure movement. So I will say again that we had best keep our wits about ourselves so that our hearts and minds remain our own. Let the following words of Ludwig von Mises resonate within your individual mind, and in the interest of emancipation from mental slavery for all humans, hopefully they will find a home in your heart. And I quote, "Spiritual movements are revolts of thought against inertia, of the few against the many, of those who, because they are strong in spirit, are strongest alone against those who can express themselves only in the mass and the mob, and who are significant only because they are numerous. Collectivism is the opposite of all this, the weapon of those who wish to kill mind and thought. Thus it begets the new idol, the coldest of all cold monsters, the state." If we do not grasp the importance of this idea, we will all once again be subjects and slaves to the status quo of the royal fable, and suffer the wrath and onslaught of the ages-old battle cry of collectivism. Because altruism, therefore dehumanization. Now, I grew up studying the ideas of people like the Hebrew King David, who admonished us to do the following. He says, "Do not put your faith in nobles or princes or in their empires to whom no salvation belongs." See, they cannot save you. They are no different than you. They will die and cease to exist just like everyone will. Right? Also, the thoughts of Paul, who wrote to Timothy saying, "We were not given the spirit of fear, but the spirit of power, of love, and of discipline," which is also rendered as self-control or a sound mind. In other words, you cannot give way to astonishment. You have to use discernment and make informed choices, especially now when once again your choice is seen as the problem. In other words, you have the con. And since we started with a thought from Marcus Garvey, let's consider another as we conclude this episode. Marcus Garvey also gave us this gem. He says, "Mind is your only ruler, sovereign. The man who is not able to develop and use his mind is bound to be the slave of the other man who uses his mind." Truer words were never spoken, and evidence of the complete disregard of this truth by those parroting the current misrepresentation of liberty, equality, and fraternity is once again clearly obvious. If you have finally made it to the conclusion of this first episode, I commend you and thank you. Part 2 will be forthcoming at some point. We still have to consider the questions and possibilities that arise from the actual experiences themselves, remember? The aerial vehicles, the technology, the entities people have claimed to encounter, abductions, etc. Oh, and we can't forget the current sitting U.S. president. I know how so totally trending it is to direct anger, hatred, and belligerence toward him, and any humans who support him, of course, in the name of humanity. But Trump is also connected to this topic of UFO ET disclosures, and we will discuss that connection in part 2. However, I'm going to move on to another topic for the next episode I put out. So I'm not sure when part 2 of this episode will be out, but it is in the works. That being said, if you found this information interesting, useful, and or thought-provoking, please consider donating to my Patreon account. I would love to spend more time working on these podcasts, but it can be a lot in addition to the activities of daily life that I'm sure you are all aware of. But in the end, I'm just like Nas over here. It's just me, and all I have is one mic. But I'm working. And these are just my very first steps. And we never know where things like this may lead. Hopefully, collaborations with like-minded individuals, possibly interviews, who knows. Though I really felt I needed to take these first steps alone for myself. It's like statuary or sculpting, clearing away the unnecessary to reveal and refine the true vision. It's a work in progress as I delve into the active literacies, and I look forward to engaging in the great conversation. And I think it's appropriate that we conclude with a little Star Trek. In a fictitious future hundreds of years from now, an android ceaselessly striving for humanity echoes the words of Socrates when he says, The most elementary and valuable statement in science, the beginning of wisdom, is, I do not know. That came from the synthetic neural pathways within the positronic matrix of Lieutenant Commander Data aboard the USS Enterprise. So thank you all for listening. Thank you for thinking. Thank you for any support you're willing and able to offer, even if it's only to let me know you're out there and listening, because that alone will greatly increase my level of motivation out of my responsibility to you, the listeners. Lastly, let's not forget to tell each other, you have the con. And always remember that it only matters if we're willing to actually take it and be responsible for our individual consciousness. Because if we don't, the UFO ET disclosure movement may lead to astonishment, and then to an extremely useful crisis, and the same public opinion manipulation toward a fabricated common good that will lead to nothing but a high-tech version of the same old royal fable, the same old status quo. Something perhaps like this.
We are Borg. You will be assimilated.
Resistance is futile. Your life, as it has been, is over. From this time forward, you will service us.
You will be assimilated.
Resistance is futile. We are the Borg. Lower your shield and surrender your ships. We will add your biological and technological distinctiveness to our own. Your culture will adapt to service us.